presentation?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Perfect.
Welcome everybody to session C08, extending your 4GL resources with 4Js. We have Michael doing the presentation. I'd like to welcome our one of our great gold sponsors, 4Js, in many years. It's all for you now, Michael.
All right. Thanks. All right. So as the slide says, I'm Mike Folcher. I'm the director of professional services at 4Js. So I'm going to just tell you a little bit about the professional services offering that we have today. All right. All right. So just a little bit about me. My introduction, at least to Informix and 4GL, I started working for SunGard K-12. So we developed software for the school districts, and then we later got acquired. SunGard sold that part off to PowerSchool. So I started as a software developer. In fact, one of my first projects I ever worked on was converting our Informix 4GL application to Genero. I pretty much started working with Genero right when it was released. So then, I moved up through the ranks there from lead developer, and then I was the software development manager for about 4.5 years. And then I decided to take a little bit of a change of direction in my career. I had done some iOS development on the side, and I had, gotten a degree in certification. So I was an iOS developer for a little over a year, and then I had a good relationship with a lot of people at 4Js. So they had kind of approached me with this opportunity to start professional services. So it sounded good and exciting, and I always liked working with the technology and the people. So I said, great. So that's how I got here. And just for my educational background, so I actually have a degree in mathematics, not in computer science. And then I went back to get a master's degree in information system. And then when I did my master's, I actually was very interested in mobile programming. So I decided to get an iOS developer certificate. So just a little bit about me and my background. So I always like to start out anytime I'm doing like a project or a presentation, talking about the goals. It helps me center myself to say, okay, make sure we're staying on track and staying, we're trying to achieve our goals and not going off on a tangent. And so it's also good for you, right, to understand these are the goals of this presentation. So I really want to first and foremost, let everyone understand what 4J's professional services offering is. And then I'll do that by obviously explaining it, but then also talk about some of the projects that we've worked on over the last 2 years. Along the way, I would also like to highlight some of the Genero features that the team has helped our customers implement, right? So I think it'll be kind of a good reinforcement if you saw the presentations that Bryn did and Laurent did. It really focused on the product and the company. And then this will kind of reinforce that with professional services. All right, so this is my attempt at, so my son really likes like the superhero movies and comics and everything like that. So this is my attempt to try to kind of match that with 4J's professional services. So the big thing now, I guess, is like the origin story of like how Batman became Batman, or so on. So the origin of what makes a superhero or a villain. So this is the origin story for professional services, at least is how I see it, right? So for the last 20 years, 4Js has been evolving Genero, right? It started out, pretty simple, where it was, multi-platform, so had a desktop client and supported much different databases. But it really, wasn't much more than that. And I think, it was a great starting point. And then over the years, 4Js has really made a significant effort, and it's a significant investment to keep pace with technology, innovations and trends, right? So they're making, they're adding support for mobile devices. They're adding, um, browser client. They're adding, web services. And these things are all great, but then it takes, time and effort for customers to adopt all these features, right? And so that's what, we were seeing in 4Js is that we had all these great technologies, we had Genero Studio and everything, but the adoption was slow just because it takes a lot of effort and time to be able to take advantage of these great things. Um, so, 4Js really saw a business opportunity to say, hey, look, when we talk with our customers and say, you requested this feature, but you haven't implemented it yet, what's holding you back? And a lot of times it was just lack of resources. Um, and so that's kind of how the Genero professional services team was born. Right? Um, so some of the goals of the professional services team, and really like the high level goal I always try to tell, people both inside the organization and outside, it's really we want our customers to be successful with Informix and Genero BDL, BDL being what we call the language itself. Um, you know, Obviously this helps our customers and it helps us too, right? Um, but we want to, and specifically, we want to help our customers by leveraging Genero. I really kind of boil it down to, I mean, most of our engagements have kind of come down to either one or two major categories, right? We're either migrating an application, it could be from Informix 4GL to Genero. It could be maybe migrating to a newer version of Genero. It could be, migrating the user interface from a terminal-based interface to either desktop or web, going on premise to the cloud. How do you do that with Genero? Well, we can help do that, as well as maybe going from a command line development environment to Genero Studio, to go to IDE. So that's kind of the first set or the first category. The second one being, extending the application. So, I want to create a web service interface for my application. Um, or, I want to create a web portal or a mobile app. It might be that, well, you just need some the kind of a getting started type thing to kickstart you so that they they can build out the framework, or it might just be that you just don't have the resources to do it all together, and you just need to hand it off to someone or a team to do that. So that's kind of what we're here for, and that's what the team was uh, created for. All right. So now I've kind of oh yeah, one more slide. Basically, who we are. So Jagaswar Malik is the vice president. Um, so he's my boss. And then so I'm the director. Obviously in the U.S. And then we have a team. Um, so we have a couple people in the U.S. and all of our developers are in India. So we have two offices in India. One's in Chennai, and then the other one is in Bangalore. And so the model that we're using is that we always want to have um, people in the local area, um, or the local region, working with the customer. So right now we've worked with primarily U.S. customers, right? So there's myself and our team in the U.S. is working directly with the customer, and then we're interfacing with the team in either Bangalore or India, or in Chennai rather. You know, Communicating that information, and then obviously sometimes the team leads work directly with the customers depending on um, you know what they're working on. But it's kind of the whole approach with 4Js itself is that they have a really close contact and communication with their customers, right? And so we want to extend that with professional services, right? We want to, we take pride in knowing and understanding our customers and giving them a high level of customer service. And we're really looking to extend that into professional services as well. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to profile um, four different projects. So they were done with four different companies. Um, and I didn't want to use the name of the company or anything like that because I just really want to get into understanding kind of how these engagements work, what they look like, um, and and things like that. So for the first company profile, so it's a company in the retail building supplies industry in the US. They have an ERP application that was written in Informix 4GL. Now it's running in Genero. They're still using the command line interface for Genero. And it manages, accounting, order entry, inventory, sales within the organization. This company's really grown a lot, mostly through acquisition in the last 10 plus years. And the ERP system is really the system of record, right? So this ERP system is used by all these new acquisitions. So they have to go through the process of migrating them into whatever ERP system they're using and bring them into the corporate fold, if you will. So because of this, they've kind of faced a lot of challenges, right? They have an ERP system that, when it was originally built, was servicing a much smaller business than it is now. So it has a lot more, complex needs. They have to deal with interfacing data from these different systems into the ERP system. Um, and and this really led to, when they were going to really start growing the application and expanding it, and how do they quickly onboard developers to address these needs. And so some of the staff, the developers there, had been to the Genero conference that we have every year, and they, during one of the presentations, like I said, piqued their interest. They saw one of the new features that had been added probably like 5 or 6 years ago about this FGLDOC. And so what it does is it basically provides some documentation. You can have inline documentation that then gets spit out. So they devised a plan to leverage this feature and some of the other features that are in Genero Studio. And their plan was to build a web portal. So they wanted users to be able to navigate just like their menu structure, right? So if they're going through the menu structure with their ERP application, they wanted a menu structure just the same way in the documentation, so that they could go to exactly what they would select on the menu, and then they could look at the module and see the documentation for the module. And then from there, be able to see like what forms it uses, what tables it uses, all of that stuff. So they wanted to leverage, the documentation. So I'll just kind of just go on a little detour and explain what is FGLDOC. So this is actually just pulled right from the Genero documentation. So I won't read it all, but essentially it says that doing documentation is no fun, but it's important. And now Genero has tools so that you can do it and makes it a little easier. And so this is just an example here of what you need to do, just so you kind of get an understanding if you're not familiar with the feature. You can document different types of objects. So this is just an example of documenting a function, but you can document a module, you can document a record, and they all have a little bit, the syntax and the different parts are a little different, but the parts of a function here are the top part here is just the short description and then a long description. Then you can have an at code block. So these at symbols are kind of important, as well as the pound plus, right? Because that's how it knows that it's a structured comment that needs to get pulled out and put into the documentation. So you can have an at code block that specifies basically how to use this thing, whether it's a record or a function. And then for functions have some specific directives or at tokens. This one, for a function, you can specify then the parameters for the function. So you basically just do at parma, and then the name of the variable, and then the description, and then the same thing with the return values. You can tell it then what it returns. And then you just run a tool, a compilation tool that spits out an HTML document. So this is kind of what the final thing looks like. So you can navigate through to all the different modules, and then you can see within the function. So this is now the documentation that we saw for that process save function. Since this uses record types, this would be a hyperlink. it's just a screenshot, obviously, but it would be a hyperlink then that you could link into and see what that record, how that record type is defined, both for both of these parameters and the return value. And then you're basically just getting the information that you put in formatted nicely. And so this was a really big initiative for the company. So, and this is the way the work was broken down. I think this is also a good example of the fact that, you don't just have to hand the professional services team a project and say, go do this and we'll see you in a couple months. They can just do a part of the whole project, right? So we handled documenting all of those files. So it was like 3 million lines of code. It was obviously a little laborious, but it helped us get familiar with the customer's code set as well by doing that. And then the customer also worked on doing a lot of the things that they wanted to do that the tool, didn't do. Like when I mentioned about them being able to traverse their menu structure, they built all of that, linking the form files that are used in each of the files. That the FGLDOC doesn't do that, so they had to add all of these things to it. But oh, so I should say, and then so the team makeup was, so there was one US based project manager, and then a team lead in India, and 3 developers. And then so this is the work environment. So if you're thinking about, for each of the projects, I kind of put this in here, and it's more so that you can think about, if you're thinking about engaging us in a project, oh, well, what do we need? Like, how are we going to get the developers to connect in? And this is kind of a popular model that most of our customers are using now, is that, they basically treat them like a contractor. So they give them an Active Directory account on the network, and then they have, some tool to offer them like a virtual desktop. So you're connecting in from their workstation into a virtual desktop that's on the customer's network. And then from there, you're treating them, like I said, like an employee or a contractor, where you have giving them access to source control. So in this case, the customer is using SVN. In this case, the customer for project management, they're using Jira. So all of our staff had Jira accounts, so they could, take tickets, assign them to themselves, move them, and communicate with the team. And then obviously what's really important is regular touch base meetings. So we had regular meetings, we would discuss progress. We would ask questions, identify problems, things like that. And then so the customer was using Genero Studio, before they engaged with the project. So that's what we were using to edit source code. And then for SVN, communication, they were using Tortoise. So that's what we used. We were checking out code. So some of the key outcomes. So the new employees were starting to become productive much earlier. Key resources were freed up to do more development. And so they even had like non-technical staff, right? So when someone would report a bug, they were able to go through with the documentation, and they could use the menu structure so they could navigate to the module, and then they could read a description of the module and the functions. And so the customer reported to us that they were actually starting to get, support people that when they would put in a ticket and they would send it to the developers, they would say, okay, it's in this area, and I think based on the description, this might be the problem. So you might want to look here. So instead of the developer having to go through and say, okay, well, now I have to figure out, do some prepping and figure out where this gets called and how it's called, the support staff is actually putting all that information in the ticket. So it's much easier for the developers to just go through and find the issue and fix it, rather than having to hunt for, well, where is this happening? And one of the other things the customer told us is it's really helping to improve the culture of the organization. So obviously the customer did a lot of work here, but we played our part as well. And that's That's what we want to hear at the end of the day, that we helped our customer be successful and improve. So, all right, that's profile one. So profile two, I'm just going to take a drink here. So again, a software company. So it's basically another ERP system, right? So they have software that manages HR, payroll, accounting, finances for state agencies in Georgia. And so they have two main applications. So they have an Informix-based terminal-based ERP system for back office users. So that's not written in Genero. And then they have a Genero self-service web portal. So this allows, people that aren't in the back office, employees, vendors, managers, they can do some self-service, right? They can view and print their W-2s, same thing with their pay stubs. They can also enter in their daily time. And then there's a whole approval process for supervisors, and then similar to leave requests. And so this engagement started, kind of, I think it was in May of 2020 when we started our first project with the customer. And they, because of COVID and all of a sudden they had these new requirements that were coming in for a lot of their systems. And it was tough to handle the workload that they kind of had planned out and to handle all these new COVID requirements that were coming. So they needed more resources. Um, so we started a project for the customer. They wanted to extend their self-service web portal to allow employees to submit travel advances and expenses. And they really have like a unique set of business rules. For example, like there was rules of when an employee was allowed to rent a car versus use their own car. Some expenses were paid by the state agency, and others they needed to pay out of pocket and then get reimbursed. So all of these rules needed to be put into the travel application. And then there weren't, detailed project specifications. We just kind of had a rough idea. So um, we kind of broke down the work in this way. So the 4J's team, we were doing, especially in the beginning, like a lot of prototyping, screen design, and then obviously we did the coding, and then we would install it into a test environment. And then the customer handled all of the database side of things. Since, both the web portal and the ERP system were using the same database, they kind of wanted to own that part of it. And as much as possible, they're using stored procedures, especially if they wanted to bake in some business logic that needed to be used by both sides. So a lot of times they would just say, okay, we'll create a stored procedure for that, and we would just know, okay, and then they would communicate to us what, the input and output parameters of the stored procedure were. And then they also handled interfacing the data into the ERP system, and then they did all of the QA testing. And so again, the team breakdown, a US-based project manager, and then we had a team lead and 2 developers. So this environment's going to be very similar to customer one, but we have Active Directory accounts for each of for everyone on the team, virtual desktop environment, and then we were connecting through remote desktop. We also had accounts on the Linux machine, so we were developing on the virtual desktops, but then deploying to Linux. So again, this customer is using SVN, so we're using that to check out code. Especially, we actually in the beginning of the project were meeting every day with the customer because we didn't have a really well-defined set of requirements. We were doing a lot of prototyping, going back to the customer, and then they would feed us in, okay, no, we like this, or can we change it to that? They were giving us direction and feedback, and then also, discussing the requirements. A lot of times, I think it's a lot easier to discuss requirements when you have something visual, right? When you can see a screen and you can start seeing the data that's on the screen, you can start saying, oh, yes, well, this this data point needs to be validated this way. So we did all of that during these daily meetings. And then as the project got going, we scaled it back to 3 times a week. The customer already had everything in with using Genero Studio, so we use that as the code editor. And then again, we were using Tortoise to interface with the SVN system. So some of the key outcomes. So we ended up completing at least the first phase of the travel application in about 6 months from the project kickoff. Actually, during the development process, the customer had identified a couple features that they want that were in Genero 3.20, but they were currently in 2.50. So we kind of put those on in a backlog of things that we wanted to do after the initial release of travel. And then so shortly after the initial release, we ended up upgrading all of the portal application to Genero 3.20, and then we were able to then backfit those features that they wanted into the travel application. And then so I just put in here, so when you get the presentation, it has a link to our documentation about the migration process from what they call in 2.50 is the web client, which the initial HTML document and everything are built on the server, and then reply, that's the response back, whereas the browser client works fundamentally different. And then so the customer also engaged us to do some other things. In fact, we're still working with the customer. So we're rewriting the time card portal application that they're using. We also built a component for the self-service portal that hosts the training manuals and training videos, and that uses a web component. And then they started also having some manager reports. We wrote those in Genero Report Writer, and they're on the portal as well. So I'm just going to kind of go over some of the features. So this was one of the key features that they wanted to move to 3.20 for, and that's in 3.20, and obviously then in 4.0, you can have actions that are on a row. So this is a display array, but it has icons that are clickable, and then they trigger a specific action for that row. So this is what they used for the manual and video help portal. So it's just a little web component that can display. In this case, this is displaying a PDF. So this is a Genero program in the web, and then this is a web component, and it's just embedded, has an embedded PDF in it. And then this is the same thing with the video. So this Genero button, when you press the load video, it loads the video into the web component, and then you can see here it's 4 seconds into the movie or video. And then so I actually have these examples are on GitHub. So if you're interested, you can take a look. And then so for Report Writer, for those of you who maybe haven't seen Report Writer before, so this is an example of just a report that maybe was doctored up a little bit with Report Writer and formatted. And then this is an invoice. So this is you can go through to maybe making your reports a little bit nicer, to doing something like this where this is an invoice where it's have logos and background colors or images and everything like that. And so you can also use this link. These images were actually pulled right from this, and it kind of shows you some of the built-in templates that exist within Report Writer, and both of these are actually part of the built-in templates. All right, so on to company 3. So for this next project, so the company 3 is a retail electronics store in the US. They currently have an Informix 4GL ERP system, and it's managing order entry, accounting, accounts payable, receivable, inventory, all of the back office stuff. The customer also has a e-commerce application. So, obviously customers can order electronics off the web. I think that's pretty much commonplace nowadays, right? And so that's actually written in Java and Oracle. So they kind of have this, they have all these, plumbing back and forth to transfer data and everything like that. And so like some of the data has to live in both places, and it's confused, it makes things a lot more complicated. So what the customer really wants is the ERP system to work for both Informix and Oracle. But obviously, that's something that Genero can do. It supports a lot of different database engines, not just Informix. So the customer's considering migrating their Informix 4GL application to Genero to take advantage of this. The customer really doesn't want to change the user interface or anything like that. And they don't want to have a bunch of branching logic in the code, right? That says, if it's Informix, do this, else. If it's Oracle, do this. They don't want code like that all over the place. And the code needs to run against both databases, right? Because they want to keep one source of data, so they might have to move tables from Oracle or to Informix. So they want the code to really be able to run against both databases without having to have, these little mini applications to push and pull data between the two systems. So as far as the work breakdown, we had to analyze the existing database structure, and we did that, and we built like basically a migration guide. So what you'd have to do to be Oracle compliant in your application. So we had to create some of the Informix data structures in Oracle, and then we had to migrate some of that data over from Informix to Oracle. And then obviously there were some Genero coding changes that we need to make. So on the company side, they were providing us with guidance and decision making and doing QA testing as well. So I just want to do a little quick detour about the Genero ODI. So that's the open database interface that exists within Genero. And so what the ODI does is it allows you to write Informix SQL. So you can use the Informix SQL syntax and features, but those gets translated to whatever the target database is. So that doesn't have to be Informix. So this is very well documented, and depending on which database you're targeting, it kind of they all have caveats. But essentially, some of the things that it does do specifically for Oracle is it does the serial field emulation. It basically switches matches to like. There are some exceptions because match is a little stronger than the way like works. Does simple things like changes unique to distinct. It also does some date and date time conversion. So Oracle doesn't have a strictly date object. Their date, or sorry, yeah, data type rather. So their date data type actually has time in it as well. But the ODI handles that. So if you have a date variable, that it knows to just basically make the time 000000. There's also support for skip and first. So in Informix you could say I want the first 10 records. That gets translated over into the Oracle specific syntax. And then you can also use special keywords like today and current. They'll get converted to sysdate or systimestamp in Oracle. There are some things that just are different. That's because these database engines at the end of the day are fundamentally different. And so there are things that need to be handled by the developers. So some examples of this are the length function. So in Informix, right, if you have the value ABC in a character column that's 50 characters long, when you do a length, it's basically going to trim that. It's going to trim the white space on the right, and it's just going to give you the length of the value, whereas Oracle does not do that. So if you do a length of char 50, it's always going to return 50. So some of the other differences, right, is the matching. So you can't, like, the like syntax in SQL doesn't support, bracket and a range. So that's something that needs to be handled by the programmer. Also the substring. So substrings, the ODI does handle when you have a substring that's on the right-hand side. But if it's on the left-hand side, like this, an example, right, you can do like update, and you just want to update, position 3 and 4 with the characters N and O, that works in Informix, but it doesn't work in Oracle. And then the for update locking is also different. So in Informix, when you set the lock mode, it's per session, right? So if you set lock mode to no wait, it's on the session, whereas Oracle, you need to specify it on the SQL statement itself. You have to basically, select whatever from table, where are my conditions for update, and then it needs to say, lock mode, no wait, or lock mode wait 10 for 10 seconds. So just some differences that, there's always going to have to be some coding changes that you're going to make, but the ODI does handle, a large majority of them. Okay, so back to the project. So the 4J's team for this was one, again, US based project manager, and then a team lead from India, and then 3 developers. So again, so we were, treated just like contractors, right? So each team member had an Active Directory account, a virtual desktop, and each developer also has like a virtual Linux development environment, since they're, a Unix Linux shop. And then the code is in a Git repository, so we have access to push and pull. And then so we meet 2 times a week with the customer to review work, discuss obstacles, and monitor progress. And so for this project, the customer uses VI for development, so that's what we're using. So using VI to edit code. So this project is still ongoing. So we engaged in a 4-month pilot with the customer, and we're just doing a subset of the application to start out with. They really want to make sure that we do a pilot, and they want to, thoroughly test it before they move forward with the solution. So customer 4, I'm just looking. Looks like I'm doing okay on time. All right. So this is the last of the customer profiles that I have. Another drink of water. All right. So this is a software company providing, tax, accounting, and financial management for local governments in Pennsylvania. So this customer is currently using a product that 4J's released in the late 90s. It's called BDS, I believe stands for Business Development Suite or System. So it's much closer to the 4GL or Informix 4GL language, and it runs in a GUI client, and it runs on both Windows and Linux. So the customer has Windows users as well as Linux users. So the customer really wants to modernize their UI, UX, and their application, but I mean, obviously, this is a daunting task, and they're a pretty small shop, right? They only have 4 or 5 developers, and most of them are keeping up with regulatory changes and customer issues and things like that. And they're not really interested in going to the web just yet. They really just want a GUI application, but they want it to be in Genero, so it looks a lot more modern. So we met with the customer a couple times, got a good kind of high-level understanding of the application, and we knew it was a big application, but again, we wanted to kind of chunk it down and say, okay, we want to do a 5-week pilot. So we kind of picked one of the application areas, and then we said we'll redesign everything. We'll meet with you weekly. So we'll make your forms look more modern. Um, and then we'll deliver you the code and we'll document what changes we made, and then we can kind of take it from there. If you want us to do more, we can do that. If you guys want to say, okay, we're going to take it from here, we'll do that as well. So, so the team construction, obviously, again, I sound like a broken record now, but I think it's important to note, we're always going to have a local project manager and then a team lead in India and 2 developers in this project. And so in this work environment was a little different. So the customer actually gave us their database, so they gave us an Informix export, and then they gave us their code, and then we just spun, we created the database on our Linux server, and then we created a Git repository for the customer's code. We just ported the code to Genero Studio. The customer uses VI for editing files. And then so all of our developers are kind of have the code locally, using Git to pull and push, and Genero Studio, but our Informix server is centralized. And then we meet once a week with the customer and get input. And then we're also doing a code drop to the customer once a week, so they can kind of take a look at the code and understand what we're doing. And so this is also an ongoing project. So we're in actually week 3 of the 5-week project. And then so I did want to talk a little bit about, so one of the things that the customer does right now in BDS is that they have this like a generic lookup window. So so if you're on a field, right, that's table verified, you can do right now in BDS, they do like, I think, Control Z, and then it gives them a zoom window and it gives them a list of all of the records, and then they can select the record that they want instead of having to know the code, right? So this is a pretty common pattern. And they had built this generic form, so they had basically an array of records, and so they were building out these long strings so that they could use the same form, and then they would build out an array of strings, essentially, or character 80, an array of char 80, and then they would pad them so everything would line up, and then they would have one field on top that wasn't part of the array that would be the headers. So in Genero, you can actually write something that builds a dynamic form and to do all of this. So it would look a lot nicer, and it would actually be a lot less code because you wouldn't have to do all that string padding and everything else. So I have some code snippets here of the example just so you can kind of get an idea of how it works. So essentially you can build a form node on the fly. So this is, if you've ever done anything in JavaScript with the document object model, it's similar. So you basically get create a form from the window, which is the parent, and then the child's the form, and then you can start building out these elements of the UI. So a VBox is just basically a vertical container, and then you can build a table, and then you can see here it iterates through all the fields that you want to display. So this is just a little code snippet of creating a form on the fly. And then you can also do the same thing, and actually Laurent touched upon this on his presentation yesterday, is you can also use Dynamics SQL. So this is a little fetch routine that we're using to fetch the data. And so it actually returns back a structure, one of the built-in structures with Genero called a JSON array. It's just an array of JSON objects. And since JSON essentially you can use JSON to express a record, you can fetch all the data, you can use this generic SQL handler. So you can see here, this one supports paging. So if you're doing paging and you need to fetch, like the third page, then you can open a scroll cursor. Otherwise, you can just open the cursor. It also supports parameterized SQL statements, so you can just give it takes a list of parameters and loops through the parameters and injects them. And then this is just a continuation of the function. And then it just loops through, and for every row that it fetches, it converts the row to a JSON object and then puts it into the JSON array. And then it says, all right, have we filled up the page if there is paging? So you could set the result set, right? If you only wanted 200 records, even you could have even supply a button that says, okay, fetch the next 200 records, and it would go through and you could, use the same structure to do that. And then the last part that kind of glues everything together is the dynamic dialog, right? So usually then you would have a display array in 4GL to do that. So you can actually build that dialog. So this is an example of that. So it just opens up a window, and then it uses some of the code that I showed you before to create the form. And then this third from the bottom here, this create display array to actually builds this display array in memory and gives you an object handle to it. And then you could add triggers. So in this case, I just have accept and cancel, but obviously you could enter in, create as many triggers as you want. And then you kind of have this is the area that actually sets the data. So it's taking the result set, and it's just, which is an array, a JSON array. So that's what this data table is. And then since it basically just takes every element of the array, and then it loops through the items in the JSON object. And since the JSON object is just basically, key value pairs, you're basically just setting the field, which, that's what a column is, right? Or a field is a name and a value. So it just populates all of that. Just have some special logic here for the customer to hide the field if it's a serial field, right? There's no reason for the user to see the serial value. And then at the end, it makes sure that the current row is set back to 1. And then this is actually the UI loop. So selected row by default is set to -1, and then it just loops here. If the user cancels, they didn't select any row, it's set to 0. If they do select a row, it gets the selected row. Either way, it breaks out of the loop, closes the dialog, closes the window, and returns the selected row. So, and then it looks something like this. This is what a table, if you are not familiar with Genero, this is what a table and a display array looks like in Genero. This is the desktop client, but it looks very similar on the web. You can drag and you can move columns, you can sort by columns, basically get all this for free, right? Because it's just doing it on the front end. The back end, it doesn't change. And so I would just put this is a link to a GitHub repo that Ruben, one of our colleagues, created, and he has tons of examples of how to do this. A lot of them you can just drop right in to your app, or you can just look at them and quote unquote borrow what you need. So any questions?
Mike, I didn't see any questions in the chat come up at all, and we're about out of time now.
All right, yeah, the last thing I want to mention is that if you're interested, you can contact your local 4J support. But we are having a conference right the week after Thanksgiving. So you'll learn more about Genero if you're interested.
Okay, thank you everybody for attending, and 4J's for being one of our gold sponsors this year. I also like to remind you that at 3:10, they will be starting the first tutorial on the certification badge training. Have a nice rest of the day, people. Bye.
All right, thanks.